The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, with the world seemingly out of control, where does Canadian foreign policy go from here? Then, a fictional takeover of Canada by the United States isn't so fictional anymore. We'll meet the man who dreamed up this scenario more than 50 years ago. That's all next on The Agenda. From an America that's turning its back on longtime allies and towards Russia, to a Europe that is quickly rearming, it's hard not to get the sense that we are at an historical turning point in how the world is ordered. But what does it all mean for Canada? How should our foreign policy, long influenced by America, change amidst this upheaval? Let's ask. In Washington, D.C., Janice Nye, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at U of T. In Montreal, Quebec, Jennifer Welsh, Professor of Global Governance and Security and Director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And with us here in studio, Seva Gunitsky, Associate Professor of Political Science at U of T and author of Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century. Seva, it's good to see you again here. And Janice and Jennifer, real pleasure to have you both on the line from Points Beyond. I want to start by reading a tweet that our friend Andrew Coyne from the Globe and Mail recently tweeted. This is from last week, in which he said, "We are living through history on fast forward. The whole strategic architecture of the world is being reshaped in the space of a few days." Let's start there. Janice, do you agree with that observation?
I do agree with Andrew, see, but it is not a matter of days. This has been coming for years. Global trade is declining and the world has been regionalizing. Europeans have been investing more in Europe. Asians have been doing the same. And we are seeing a fundamental reordering of the system that actually probably starts up to the global financial crisis. But with this president in office, it has been put on steroids. Canadians should have noticed this a long time ago.
Jennifer, how do you see it?
Yes, I agree that in terms of the big power shifts and regionalization that we have been seeing over the last couple of decades, some of this should not be seen as surprising. And I certainly think in terms of tariffs and industrial policy in the U.S., we've seen some of this before, though not at this level. When we think about the stance of the Trump administration to international institutions, again, some of it perhaps an exaggeration of previous positions, but we've seen some of it before. What I think is more different is behavior and values. And I think in the space of a very short period, it has become much more clear to the Europeans that the U.S. is not essentially having their back in terms of European security. So a greater push for strategic autonomy. But also, and I think this comes more from Vice President Vance than President Trump, there has been real shock at the degree to which the U.S. administration is questioning domestic politics in a number of places. I think particularly of Vance's speech at the European Security Conference, where he was admonishing European leaders for their lack of commitment to free speech, for their domestic political choices. So I think those last two, that has been more exaggerated over the last couple of weeks, and it has really pushed some dramatic decisions.
Let me pick up on that Vance speech in Europe, and Seva, I'll read this from Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting, Friedrich Merz, to set up the question for you, because he said this shortly after winning the recent German election on Feb 23. He said, "My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the USA. I never thought I would have to say something like this, but after Donald Trump's statements, it is clear that the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe." How significant a statement is that in your view?
Well, I think we are finally entering this post-American world that so many commentators have been predicting for years. And it's funny, there have been debates for so long about how this was going to happen exactly, but I don't think anybody predicted that it would happen because the superpower is itself actively undermining its global standing, its alliances, the very system that it built. That's different. And I grew up in the USSR during Gorbachev's reforms, so obviously the situations are very different, but it is very strange to me to again see a major power undertaking radical reforms that are not very well thought out, that so blatantly undermine its own standing.
Just to follow up, you thought the world order might deteriorate, but you didn't see the United States leading that deterioration? Is that the point?
I didn't think the crisis would come from the center itself. Everybody talks about the rise of China, but the fact that the U.S. is actively undermining its own standing is bizarre to me. And I think we'll find out that, the unipolar system is the worst system except for all the others. I think we're finding that out. There are legitimate criticisms to be made of the global order that the U.S. built, that it wasn't liberal in many places, it wasn't even very orderly, but it did provide a degree of stability, and it made smaller countries feel comfortable, at least acquiescent. And that's gone. The U.S. is no longer the guarantor of that order, at least for the next few years. And that means it's acting more like some kind of a landlord collecting rent from people who didn't even know they were renting from them. So he's pushing a multipolar world into being. This is a great gift to Russia and China. You can see the jubilation in Russia now. And Trump basically seems to think that the U.S. is the indispensable nation and therefore can do what it wants. And if it does what it wants, it will grow stronger. But, the graveyard of history is filled with indispensable nations, and there's no reason the U.S. can't join that club if it keeps going the way it does.
If there is, Janice, so much consternation from Canadians, from half of Americans, from much of Europe, why is the United States doing this?
Look, that is a $64 million question here. Seva has it exactly right. The United States is clearly undermining itself over the long term. But Donald Trump and the people around him, and there is a coherent ideology by these people. This is not as random and as erratic as it looks. They see the United States as a power that has paid the freight for too long, in Seva's language, that the benefits they got from the so-called liberal international order, and I agree with Seva, it wasn't always very liberal and it wasn't always very orderly, but the benefits they got, they thought, are, and I disagree very strongly with them, but that's what these people think, is outweighed by the costs that they have been paying. So all this language about the United States paying too much, being ripped off. There is a 19th century imperial mercantilist view of the world. And it's among some of Trump's advisors, and this is long thought out. And the United States, in their view, will grow stronger internally, will restore its manufacturing and its dominance in the world if it invests in itself and actually pulls back from the world and doesn't let the world exploit it. That's how they understand history.
Jennifer, I want to set up my next question to you by hearing from two different Trudeaus. Our 15th Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, said at the National Press Club in Washington in 1969, living next to you, the Americans, is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered the beast, one is affected by every twitch and grunt. A famous quote from Pierre Trudeau. Let's fast forward 50 years and listen to our 23rd Prime Minister. Here's Justin Trudeau from this past week. Sheldon, the clip if you would.
He has said repeatedly that what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us, is the second half of his thought. Now, first of all, that's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. But yeah, he can do damage to the Canadian economy, and he's started this morning.
Is the elephant, Jennifer, no longer our friend?
Well, that first quote about sleeping with an elephant and the reverberations, we've certainly felt it over the last couple of weeks with the absolute upending of our domestic politics as a result of what is going on in the United States. I think the approach to the tariffs, despite all of the efforts of our Canadian diplomats, of our Canadian politicians to try to avert them, shows that this is a very adversarial president with respect to our economic interests. And we need to stop assuming good intentions behind that. I don't see outright annexation as the long run story here, but I do see attempts to try to hollow out our economy, as Janice has described, by moving business and wealth to the United States. I see a much more aggressive approach to our natural resources, to what we have in the ground up here that is seen as valuable to the U.S. here, but also elsewhere in the world, critical minerals. And I also see them becoming much, much stronger on defense. But I think it's above all the way in which the negotiations and the diplomacy are taking place. So to give you one example that you may not have picked up on because there was so much going on in the last week, was the way in which Donald Trump, in talking to Justin Trudeau about economic issues, slipped into the conversation that the U.S. is not very happy on the negotiations around the Columbia River Treaty, a 60-year-old treaty designed to manage our water relations. So I think it is this style, this approach to negotiation with the United States that we have to completely change our way of entering into those compared to how we did so in the context, say, of a free trade arrangement in past years.
And Jennifer, I could just add, because Jennifer's just brought up a really important point there. It wasn't only about the Columbia River Treaty. He expressed concern about the way we share water on the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
Just think about that. And water is something the United States really needs, as we know, given the accelerating pace of climate change. And just for everyone to understand, we have a treaty that governs water sharing, but any state that borders the Great Lakes can drain beyond its quota if there is not willingness to cooperate. So when I read that report in the New York Times, that was a flashing red light for me.
Well, I hate to be a bigger downer, but it's not just the water, and it's not just the Columbia River, and it's not just the 51st state nonsense, and it's not just about crushing our economy. But last week, the New York Times reported that in the talks between Trudeau and Trump, this came forward. He told Mr. Trudeau that he did not believe that the treaty that demarcates the border between the two countries was valid, and that he wants to revise the boundary. He offered no further explanation. While Mr. Trump's remarks could all be bluster or a negotiating tactic to pressure Canada into concessions on trade or border security, the Canadian side no longer believes that to be so. Seva, I mean, the approach, do we take these remarks at face value, or do we think this is just negotiating tactics?
Yeah, so Trudeau was worried about elephant's accidental twitches, and now the elephant is up and stomping around very consciously, which is much worse. And I think Canada should treat these threats of annexation as kind of signals of a deeper shift in U.S. strategy, in U.S. policy. Even if literal annexation is improbable at this point, it signals a shift to a transactional zero-sum relationship. And again, that's not going anywhere for the next few years. So the danger is not necessarily invasion, but sort of a creeping chaos and creeping erosion of Canadian sovereignty as the U.S. continues to disregard Canadian interests and Canadian economics, Canadian diplomacy. And as you played in the clip just now, Trudeau basically said that Trump wants to soften up the Canadian economy in order to make it easier to annex. Even if you think annexation is unlikely, that's a very dangerous short-term strategy for Canada that they should be worried about. And it's not even clear exactly why Trump is so antagonistic towards Trudeau. It could be he has a personal dislike for him.
Well, there's at least that, for
sure. At least that, and in which case maybe that's a good thing, because with Trudeau leaving, Trump can take credit for it. I'm sure he will, and maybe it'll calm him down. But if it's a structural issue, as I suspect, then it's not going anywhere. I've studied Russia for a long time, and we ask questions about Putin for a long time. Does he actually mean what he says? Is he crazy enough to do that? And now we're kind of starting to ask the same questions with Trump, which is a very dangerous sign, and hopefully doesn't mean that things are going the same way.
I suspect many people watching this right now saw some of the Liberal Leadership Convention from Ottawa last night, and there were a couple of things. Well, Jean Chrétien gave a terrific speech in which he said, this is something we've never seen. This is something Canadians don't understand, the way that we're being treated by the Trump administration right now. And the outgoing Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said, this is a nation-defining moment. Democracy is not a given. Freedom is not a given. Even Canada is not a given. I mean, Jennifer, when you hear these kinds of statements, can you believe your ears?
Well, it's pretty dramatic. And that our leaders, in that sense, rhetorically are rising to the moment of the great change that we've been discussing. And I think if I could add something to the portrayal we've all been giving of the United States, I think what's important to remember is that Mr. Trump wants to operate in a club of very great powers. This is why the overtures to Russia, the re-engagement with Russia, which is causing such consternation in Europe. Why are you reaching out to a strong man? And I think on the flip side of that is the lack of respect for those who are perceived to be smaller and weak. And I think he wants to very much operate not just in the 19th century sense of imperialism, but in a way in which he uses U.S. power very coercively, very overtly. So when our Prime Minister says, Canada is not a given, our borders are not a given, it's really a rallying cry to stand up for those things we value and believe in, and to make sure that in this world in which Trump wants to deal with the strong, that we are strong, that we demonstrate the costs of what he is proposing.
Janice, we've seen for a long time, Trump has a particular affection for, I almost want to say fellow authoritarian leaders, but let's just say authoritarian leaders.
I
But
would
if
say
he,
fellow.
If he likes the great powers so much, I mean, Russia's economy is less than Texas's economy. Russia's not a great power in the sense that it once was. So why so much sucking up to Russia?
There is just enormous speculation about the grounds for, Trump's affinity to Putin. It's been going on for 9 years. We don't really have a good answer to that question, but it's real. And we have seen Trump crush Zelensky, frankly, treat him with absolute disdain. And he claims that he is doing so to get a ceasefire. But nevertheless, that deal is clearly going to be made with only token consideration of Zelensky. We're about to see a similar pattern in the Middle East, which people are not paying attention to, but it's exactly the same pattern. You reach over the head of the so-called small locals. So Jennifer's point is correct. He has disdain for the small and the weak. The real question for a country like Canada, and this weekend there was a map circulating, which it's hard to tell if it was a meme or it was a clever tweeter, in which the border between Canada and the United States was redrawn, and Southern Ontario was part of the United States. That map is not valid and doesn't come from anybody inside the Trump administration, but it raises an interesting question. What does it mean to be strong? Frankly, there is no conceivable expenditure by Canada on defense that could deter the United States if the United States were ever determined to do this. And that's, I think, an important frame for Canadians. Yes, we can diversify. Yes, we can reinvest in defense because we needed to do that for 20 disastrous years, if not more, when we haven't. But we have to also be realistic about what all those investments do. The United States is 10 times our size. We need to understand it. Zelensky needed to understand it, and so do all of China's neighbors.
If Trump thinks strength equals having nuclear weapons, which I suspect, Seva, he does, does Canada need to reacquire nuclear capability?
Well, a nuclear weapon is really the only credible defense against a powerful foe, as other countries around the world have been finding out for a long time. And look, I think a credible deterrent is necessary not because Canada can actually defend itself. And I think Janice is right. The U.S. is too powerful. But I think, especially for Trump, sovereignty is easier to respect when it's backed up by force, and especially military force or economic force. So even if Canada cannot build up a credible deterrent, I think building up its military and its cyber and intelligence capabilities, these are kind of things that enhance its sovereignty by at least sending a message to people like Trump that this is a serious country that takes itself seriously and will not be pushed around. I think that's really the only short-term solution that Canada has, and that means investments in things like the military, but that's by itself is not going to be enough.
Jennifer, do you want to build on that? If he's trying to crush our economy for the purposes of eventually annexing Canada as a 51st state, what can we actually do about that?
Well, I will answer that in a minute, but I just want to extend this conversation about nuclear weapons because, you know, one of the comments made at the start was how much of a self-defeating aspect to Trump's behavior we should be seeing in all of this. We need to look at this whole discussion around nuclear weapons as one that is highly destabilizing. We have Poland talking about acquiring a nuclear weapon. We have the possibility, if deterrence fails on the Korean Peninsula, that South Korea will acquire a weapon, and Japan has quietly made clear that if that happens, for regional reasons, it will move to acquire a weapon. So all of this is incredibly destabilizing. We have Emmanuel Macron talking about extending the French deterrent. So this is another layer of instability that really moves so far away from 75 years of extended deterrence by the United States. And so what, coming back to your question, is a Canada to do? I think, you know, Janice has said it very well. There's no way that in the short or even medium term, we can build up the kind of military force that would express strength to the United States. But I do think we need to take a page out of what is happening in Europe. It has been dramatic, the changes they have made, including through legislative changes, a $150 billion fund now being set up in the European Commission, a waiving of deficit rules in Germany, even discussion around the creation of a European rearmament bank. These are really bold decisions. We can say they should have come earlier, but they're a signal to Canada of just the kind of change in foreign policy we need to be thinking about here as we go forward, alone, but also with our allies.
Well, in which case, Janice, do we do what the Europeans are talking about now, which is essentially go our own way, assume that we are in a world where America is no longer our best friend. In fact, they may be an adversary, and we've got to just change the way we do business?
You know, I certainly think we have to assume that America, the United States, is not our best friend as long as there's president in his office. But let's be careful not to conflate this administration with Americans, right? We have many friends inside the United States. It's important to remember that. Steve, the larger issue is, and again, to be very blunt here, Canada faces unique challenges. We are the next door neighbor of the United States. The Europeans are not. For the United States to defend its own sovereignty against attacks, one of the obvious ways an attack could come against the United States is what we call over the top, which means over our territory. We can't forget the United States needs us. And when President Trump gets any kind of advice from whoever is his chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they will tell him that the United States needs Canada to cooperate. So there are limits to the disruption that Trump can inflict on us. And it's very important for Canada to recognize the assets it has in this relationship. It is not all one-sided. That is not true for Europe, but it is true for Canada. And that's why I don't want to put us in that basket.
Sevi, you know the great quote, I think Rahm Emanuel said it most recently, I guess, you never let a good crisis go to waste. We are clearly in the midst of a foreign affairs crisis in this country. If we don't want to let it go to waste, how do we use this opportunity to either reassert different principles that we have around the world or change our relationship with the United States?
Well, to be optimistic for a second, if I could, that's probably not a good idea at this point. But, this could be a nation-defining moment for Canada, where it sets the new rules not just for its foreign policy orientation, but for its national identity. It's been in this long-term relationship, and now the relationship is on the rocks, but there are other fish in the sea, and Canada is an attractive partner, so it should develop those relationships further. I think all it can do at this point is keep negotiating and try finding new partners, and hopefully when the next president comes in, this will give an opportunity to reset the relationship. We'll see.
It is interesting, Jennifer, that if you look at polls across the country, the one good thing Trump has done is he's united Canadians as almost never before, certainly not since Expo 67. Can I recall a time when Canadians were more bullish about being Canadian? Even in Quebec, where you are right now, there is a sense of strong love for Canada, the likes of which is perhaps a bit atypical for Quebec. What are you seeing there?
Yes, I think you're right, that there is a degree to which support for sovereignty is declining in this province. There's a sense of solidarity. And, we saw former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien last night saying we owe a debt of thanks to Trump for that. Perhaps we should give him the Order of Canada,
yes.
which was a joke, of course, but it is true that this has been galvanizing. I think what's so important, though, is that we sustain this level of solidarity when it gets tough, because it is going to get tough. And as we look at these aspects of our foreign policy, Janice mentioned the Arctic. We released an Arctic foreign policy recently. We are going to have to look at that again. We are going to need to dig deep in our pockets for defense spending. We are going to need to support businesses. And Canadians have to be brought along, but they also have to keep this level of solidarity. That is not going to be easy when it starts to hurt. And so I think, this conversation we're having now is only the start of a very long process. Yes, 4 years will pass, but it's a long 4 years. And when I look at what's coming next, I've been watching J.D. Vance. He's a young man. He may rise in the Republican Party. Yes, we may have a different party in government, but the point is we don't know. We can't assume what will come next. And so I think Canadians need to buckle up for a period of instability and really keep that solidarity strong.
Well, I hate to tell you, I don't know that J.D. Vance is going to get a chance, because I'm not sure Donald Trump is going anywhere. I think he may try again. Janice, how do we take advantage of this moment to make it work for us?
Look, I think it's really important that we get very practical. We need to increase defense spending by orders of multiples, particularly in the Arctic. That is the top of the world, and we are so badly underinvested, right? We don't have a year-round facility in our Arctic. And the United States has been asking us for years to do this. We have to do it, and we have to do it now, and we have to do it at orders of magnitude greater than Canadians have thought about doing it, frankly. That's the first and most important thing. The second big thing is we have to take down the interprovincial trade barriers that exist in this country, and we have to do it with a sense of urgency. And boy, is that hard, Steve. As you know, there are constituencies in each province that are going to scream bloody murder. Too bad. The next prime minister needs to put the provincial premiers in a room and negotiate the end of this, because if we did that, we would grow our economy by the amount that Trump has thus far put tariffs on it. And thirdly, we need to start building east-west links. They're not economic. It was easier to go north-south. We all understand that. But we have to build things which we have not been able to do in this country. The pace at which we do things is, frankly, lethal in the world in which we're living in now. And we have to figure out how to get stuff done. Leave out the ideology. We need to get stuff done in this country in a way that we once used to be able to do and are no longer able. I'm frankly out of patience.
Seva, if America is at the throats of its formerly closest allies, many of whom are in NATO. Is this the end of NATO?
Well, it's certainly suggesting a transformation of NATO. What happens to NATO if the U.S. leaves? Will it remain in some form? I think European security infrastructure will have to be created no matter what, with Ukraine in it. Now, whether or not Trump is ready to take this drastic step, it's not clear. Things change very quickly. But the overall trend is definitely a separation of the U.S. from Europe, and that means a decline in NATO's capabilities. And hopefully we'll see Europeans, as they have, take charge of this and create their own security infrastructure that doesn't rely so much on the U.S. Because there is no going back. Even if we get the most pro-Atlanticist president in the next 4 years, that thought that it could all go away in a second will always be in the back of the Europeans' minds. That's not going anywhere.
Well, that's it. Jennifer, how exactly do we plan for a future where we have Trump now, but before that we had Biden, who had a very different way of doing things, and before that we had Trump, and before that we had Obama, and before that we had Bush. The U.S. seems to whipsaw between extremes every 4 or 8 years. How do we make it in that kind of a world?
Well, as we started out this conversation by saying, there has been a big structural shift anyway. A change in the power configuration globally that has been happening for 30 years. U.S. leadership has also been changing over the last 30 years in terms of real commitment to some of the institutions that the Western alliance was relying on. It is not as if the Trump administration has been completely different in this respect. What's different is the behavior. And I think what's different, and Seva was hinting at that, is the psychological element, right? Institutions rest on more than their formal rules. They also rest on the beliefs of leaders that they're going to hold. So in a sense, Trump doesn't even have to formally withdraw from NATO. He can just begin to indicate that the U.S. guarantee might not be credible. And so I think for us, we can't engage in wishful thinking. We don't know what will come next in terms of the next leader in the White House post-Trump. We have to live with the world as it is and what it could be. And I think what this last couple of weeks has shown everyone is that you can't assume. You have to deal with decisions as they are actually playing out. And so we can't assume that we'll be returning to an order that we like best and that we thrive in. We have to get ready for an order that is changing regardless.
Janice, in our last 30 seconds here, maybe I could get you to follow up on that. Wither NATO in this kind of world?
Look, NATO's already damaged, Steve. Trump doesn't have to do anything more than he's already done. He's crippled NATO because it's not clear that the United States would honor Article 5, which is the commitment to self-defense if it were invoked.
Although he was asked that directly the other day, Trump was, and he did say, yes, I do believe in Article 5.
Yeah, that was the day he said that.
Yeah.
What will he say next week, right?
Exactly.
And that's the question that everybody is asking. And that's underlying the structural shift that we're talking about. This, in a sense, is what opens the possibility of nuclear proliferation, because when smaller countries are insecure, France is saying, we will extend our nuclear umbrella to all of Europe. Well, that second strike nuclear umbrella, just so that everybody understands, is for quite old submarines. That is the sum total of the second strike capability that France has. So Europe is going to reorganize itself. It has to. We have to invest. We have no choice. Yes, some of our allies are obvious targets of collaboration, but Canada stands alone, uniquely exposed along with Mexico, because we are the next door neighbors to this United States. And we have to deeply understand that and shift the way we spend the resources we had in ways that Canadians probably genuinely don't want to do, but we will have no choice.
I want to thank the three of you for coming onto our program tonight and helping us make some sense of a completely nonsensical world right now. Janice Stein from the Monk School, Jennifer Welsh, the Max Bell School, Seva Ganitsky, University of Toronto. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
You might think all this talk of the United States taking over Canada is unique to the era of Trump. However, the fact is, someone wrote about this very scenario more than half a century ago in two best-selling books. The first was called Ultimatum, and the second, Exoneration. And they told the story of a voracious America trying to take over resource-rich Canada. The author followed that up with a third installment in the series in 2007. And he is with us tonight. He is Richard Romer, World War II veteran, Canada's most decorated soldier, and the author of more than 30 books. Lieutenant General Romer just celebrated his 101st birthday in January, and we are delighted to welcome you back to TVO.
Always nice to be here and in your presence.
Amen to that, sir. Let us start with this. What made you think, more than 50 years ago, that this kind of conflict between the United States and Canada could be possible?
Well, I suppose if I look back on it, I can't answer the question for you because it all sort of came together. The things that I was doing in my practice of law at that time, I had a great involvement with the Americans. I had a great involvement with people in northern Canada, and a whole bunch of things were happening. One of the things that was happening was there was a great deal of natural gas and crude oil being found in the high Arctic that hadn't been there before. So I was interested in the pipelines that were being put together. And I wound up at Nunavut quite often dealing with the people there and the situation. But when it came to the business of writing, I was new at the game. I had chaired the Royal Commission on Book Publishing in Ontario, and I knew who all the publishers were. And so I had a storyline that I thought I should develop, and I started to talk to some publishers about doing that.
But when you did it and you explained what the plot would be, America invading Canada to take our resources, did any of them come back at you and say, this is too fanciful, it's not believable?
No, they didn't do that at all. They were a little stunned by the proposition, but the reality was that I could feel the whole situation. I knew there was a lot of demand from the United States to run things for us, whether we liked it or not. That has not changed in the 50 years. And so when I got to put the plot together for Ultimatum, it was a big focus on the high north, the Nunavut area, the Arctic Islands, which I knew quite a bit about at that point. I was still practicing law, so I was able to fold some legal questions into it. And I was watching very carefully what was happening in Parliament. And so when it came time to put it all together, I had the Prime Minister leading the party of the day in the House of Commons and handling the whole question from his point of view. And on the other side, I had the President of the United States, who was a mean SOB, and he decided that he was going to take over Canada. Take over Canada. He's going to actually say, you are now American citizens. And I've got a great section in the book where he makes a little speech like that. It was right on the money.
So tell me this, in Ultimatum, how well does our fictitious Prime Minister stand up to the bully boy president?
He stands up very, very well, as a matter of fact. And, but at the same time, you have to read the book to find out what ultimately happens. That's the problem. But it was a book that surprised me in terms of the way it did turn out in the end result. And it's exactly what's happening today. The Americans right now they're getting everybody in Europe mad at them. The vice presidents of the United States is over telling the Germans and the French, everybody what they should be doing, making terrible speeches. They're out of their minds. But that's what the Americans are right now. They've got this man who's the president. He's an articulate, highly intelligent fellow with a great memory. And when he talks, it just keeps rolling out. He thinks about everything as he's speaking it, whether it makes sense or not. He makes sense with it. And he's in big danger for Canada, in my opinion, as a nation. And he's already landing on the Europeans in a way that unbelievably dumb.
Let me ask you about that. Why is it, or perhaps you can help us make sense of the fact that the current president of the United States can't really get along with his fellow democratic country leaders, but he gets along quite well with authoritarians and dictators all over the world. Explain that.
It's because he speaks to them. He considers himself to be superior to them intellectually, brain-wise, and he can put together a proposition to put to the French or the Germans, and that's exactly what he's doing. I sent his vice president over to tell people all kinds of terrible things, that they're dumb, and they shouldn't be doing this and that and the other thing. Who is he? He knows everything. The man is a completely self-centered egotist, and he's got a brilliant memory and a great vocabulary. If you watch him on television, and when he's in a crowd, he can out-talk anybody. He can listen to a question, and he'll have an answer for it right off the bat. He's an amazing guy.
Now, of course, in your book, which you wrote as fiction, America has its designs on our natural resources, because this was in the 1970s. There were OPEC oil shocks. The price of gas was going through the roof. It was a different time in that regard. Do you have any reason to believe that there is an actual plan on the books in the American military to take over our resources by force if they determine it's necessary?
I would not be surprised if I would be surprised if such a plan does not exist. I think they've come to the point now with this leadership that the generals behind locked doors are sorting out all kinds of plans to execute in the event the decision is made by the president to take over Canada. I have no doubt about that at all, the way things are going at the moment.
And what would we do if they did that?
There's not much we could do. We don't have a force. Our military force, which I know something about, is almost next to nothing because of the way it's been treated by governments. We are not able to fight them off, although I have a plan that I would use if I were in that position.
I'm all ears.
All right, all right. I would do simply the same sort of thing that I did with the book. I would allow the Americans to come in with their airplanes and their fighters and all of their equipment and potentially take over the airports and travel systems, and then pull the rug on them by force. We would shoot at them and catch them. And in the book, I get them defeated by our Canadian Reserve Force and Air Force, and the Americans take their big airplanes and fighters and go home because we have defeated them. Now that's fiction, but the reality is I don't see us being able to do much at all because the American concept of Canada is really next to zip. We're not anything that they have to be concerned about.
But when you wrote this book 50 plus years ago, these series of books 50 plus years ago, did you ever in your wildest imagination think this could really happen someday?
Of course I did in my wildest imagination. That's why I was able to write the book. But the reality, I still don't I don't think it will happen, but I know it can happen. And as the days go along and Trump is opening his mouth and his brain, as figurative as he is, he will talk himself into doing something which is going to be irrevocable, and it can very easily happen. I don't know how we would really reply to it. Maybe I should write another book to find out what.
Well, you have written another book, and we'll get to that in a moment here, because you're over 30 now, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
Over 30. Okay. Let me ask you about NATO. Article 5 of the NATO Charter says that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. If the United States were to attack a fellow NATO member, is that to suggest that the rest of the NATO countries ought to come to the defense of that country that's been attacked?
According to the written part of it, yes. But to the real part of it, the United States would just run over everybody and say, we're the strongest one in the world, and if you want to interfere in what we're doing, we'll talk about it, but don't waste my time. We're going to go on, and we're just telling Canada that you belong to us, you're our citizens, you should be very pleased that we give you the citizenship, and behave yourselves and shut up and go home. Something like that.
You've been around for a few years.
One or two.
Just a few. Can you recall a time in your life when the fervor of anti-Americanism in Canada was as intense as it is right now? I mean, we see it in this Four Nations face-off hockey tournament where the Star-Spangled Banner is being booed. There's a lot of anti-Americanism in the country. Have you seen it worse?
No. I think it's as strong as it is now, and it's going to get stronger because the people who are here, we're a country made up of people who are immigrating. We've got immigrants by the tens and hundreds of thousands in the country. They know nothing about our background, but they come here and become Canadians. And I think that the feeling of Canadians across the board, wherever they've come from, it can be very strong, because if they think that they're being unfairly treated, which is the operative bunch of words, unfairly treated, which is what we would expect of the Americans, the way they're going now, they will resent it very much, even if they've already lived here and been citizens for a couple of years. They'll be saying, we're Canadians. We don't need this kind of stuff. I think that there's going to be an increasingly feeling in this country of respect for Canada itself by the people who live here now.
You got to hand it to Trump. One thing he has done is unify Canadians like no one else has been able to do.
That's correct.
You've seen this.
Sure. Yeah. And he's doing the same thing in Europe now. Can you imagine Trump telling the French and the Germans, sending his vice president over there to tell them what they're doing? They're dumb people. Unbelievable. But
well, let me ask you about that, because I'm guessing you have seen every president since Franklin Roosevelt speak, or you have known them. You have seen them do their thing.
I've met many of them, and
you've met many of them. How does Trump compare to all of those that you have seen?
Well, it's very hard to compare him to any one of them. He's by himself in terms of who he is. He's not like any one of them. One of my favorites was I've had some good American presidents who I like very much and have met. But this man is all by himself. He's just unique.
If you were in a room with him, let's say there were a set of circumstances where you had a chance to meet him and give him a piece of your thinking on how he's handling Canada, what would you tell him?
I tell him he has to stand back, look at what Canada is, what Canada can do for his nation economically, what Canada has done in the past, war-wise and battle-wise, and that we are not a threat to him, and we are supplying so much of the raw material he's using, particularly in the metals. He should just stand back and say that we'll step up our trade relationship with Canada on a friendly basis. Never mind the hard stuff. I'd probably try that for size.
Okay. I want to just, in our remaining moments here, do something else with you, which is to say, one of the highlights for me of going to the November 11th Remembrance Day services at Queen's Park every year is to hear you speak, because you go and you speak on behalf of the troops. And in fact, we've got a few pictures here. Sheldon, why don't you roll these in? Here is you arriving with, that's your aide-de-camp, Rick, from the Canadian Forces.
Rick, yeah.
You're arriving for the November 11th ceremony. This is the past November 11th.
Yes.
At Queen's Park. There you are with, I think that's Laura Smith, who's a member of Parliament responsible for Veterans Affairs at Queen's Park.
Yes.
A Conservative member from Thornhill, at least in the previous Parliament. And there you are again. Look at all that chest full of medals you've got there, General. I think you are the most decorated soldier in Canadian history. You missed a few years of attending that ceremony from bad health, but you were back last November for the first time in a little while, and I wonder what that was like for you.
Well, it was like this, the way it went was I called the Premier. It's a friend of mine, and I said, Premier, it's time that I spoke again with you at Queen's Park. I built the Veterans Wall. There, it took me 6 years to do it, but you got it built for me. And
well, the previous guys got that built, in fairness.
No, but I dealt with them.
Yes, okay.
I dealt with each of them, but he is the current premier. They all were supportive of it. Of
yes,
course.
but the McGuinty government got it done.
Yeah, we
Okay.
got it done. And but in my last speech, that's when I said to the premier who was standing there, there's one thing I want to fix. The back wall of the wall is blank, and when people drive into Queen's Park, they see this blank wall. I want you, Premier, to put a sign on the back that says Veterans Memorial Wall.
And you said this in your speech in front of everybody there.
Absolutely.
And he smiled while you were giving him
And he agreed to
double
do
hockey
it.
sticks.
He said he knows what he should do.
Is he going to get it done?
Oh, it's right on the verge of being done. It'll be, we'll have a big ceremony in relation to it.
Okay. Sheldon, let's get a shot of this. If you thought the General at 101 was finished writing books, you were wrong. This is the book he has been working on for the last year or so. It's called Canada's Arctic, Moscow's Next Ukraine. What is this story about?
The story is about the attempt to begin with of the Russians to move in on our territory to the north. They take over one or two of our islands in the Arctic, and we come to the point where we, by force, send in our best troops by air, regular force and reserve, and instead of having a big battle, they talked about what could be done by way of agreement. And so the book deals with all the things that we have to negotiate with the Russians and all the other people involved in the high Arctic and all the assets that are there. And so
I get very concerned about what's going on in your mind. 50 years ago, you got the Americans invading us. Now you've got the Russians invading us. Who's next?
Oh, I think the Russians are the biggest concern. There's only room for the Russians now.
Okay, last question. You're 101. How you doing?
I keep breathing. Breathing is the essential part of life. I don't move the way I used to move at all, but I have all kinds of things. I'm going to be over in
You're going to Holland.
Holland
Yes.
for May the 5th.
You know, I do remember your telling me a story not too long ago about how when you were a little kid, you looked up in the sky and you saw a plane flying overhead, and at that moment you decided you wanted to be a pilot. And
Yes, that's
I
correct.
wonder how different your life might have been if when you looked up in the sky and didn't see anything, if you didn't see that plane, how different your life might have turned out.
But you can only speculate on that. But the reality is my relationship with airplanes began in a park across the street. My father was working at Dunlop building tires. He was a young, great athlete. And he moved from Hamilton over to Buffalo. And I was born just before, well, while we were living there.
You're born in Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Yep.
But my mother went back to deliver me, and so I was born at Queen and Herkimer in Hamilton. But the reality was, when I saw that airplane, I can still see it. And I don't know what kind it was, but I wanted to be a pilot. And by the time I was 19, I was flying the Mustangs through all kinds of flak, which is anti-aircraft work, and I caught Rommel and took him out.
You called in the raid on Rommel.
I did
Nearly
not-
got him killed.
Yeah. Rommel, and there was one other one. But all these things have a start when you're about 19. You go and do it. And well, I've had a long, very fortunate life, meeting people like you who turn up at these ceremonies from time to time when I'm going to speak. I don't know what I'm going to say, but you think it's okay.
You're the only guy who shows up without a text. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody else goes there with a speech written out, and you get up there and you just wing it on November 11th, and you're the only one who gets applause, and you always give the best speech.
All right, thank you. I'll accept that.
So, have a great time in Holland in May, and I will see you next November 11th at Queen's Park, if not before.
I'll look for you there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Lieutenant General Richard Romer, thanks so much and great to see you again.
Thanks for being here.
And that is the agenda for Monday, March 10th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, now that Mark Carney has taken over the leadership of the Liberal Party, what's next for Canadian politics? We'll explore that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.